Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. Hey there, I'm writing to you because I really think that my story is something wild, and you'll probably be able to make more sense of it than me. I live in a pretty rural town, down in Kansas, and a few months ago I saw the strangest thing I've ever laid my eyes on. There was this one morning that I had to go to the DMV and get a new license. Mine had expired. I got up early, way earlier than normal, and overall it seemed like a typical morning. It was then, on my drive to the DMV, when I saw it. Halfway there, I'm driving through my rural town into the more metro area of where I live, and I notice that there is some huge thing in the sky, nearly right above my car. At first, I freaked out. There was some flying object, in the sky, and whatever it was descending to the ground and fast. I thought at first that it was a plane, and that stressed me out more than anything. Was it a terrorist attack? Was there some kind of internal malfunction? I wanted to call the police or something, but the fact is I sort of figured someone else already had. Besides, I was in shock and wasn't reacting properly. Anyway, whatever it was crashing. There was a stream of smoke coming out from behind it, clear as day. The odd thing was, as it came closer to the ground, closer into my field of vision, I realized it was definitely not a plane, or a helicopter, or anything I've seen in my life. So now I'm watching it way closer, because I want to see where the thing is going to drop. I know that curiosity killed the cat, but this seemed like something important, or at least abnormal enough to pay attention to. It was shaped like a CGI starship from a Marvel movie or something. It wasn't a flying saucer, but the way it was designed looked very foreign. It was gray, and for all intents and purposes, too large to go unnoticed, and too large to be in the sky for that matter. Eventually, after a short while, I see it descend closer and closer to the ground. Nearby, but definitely a few miles out. I figured, hey, I'm already late for my appointment. I should go see what the hell this is about. So now I'm speeding my way towards where I saw the thing crash. I was going quick as hell, and I got there in less than 10 minutes. I parked on the side of the road because it crashed in a kind of woodsy area I could only get to on foot. I can't lie, the adrenaline was high, and I was very excited to find this thing and figure out what the hell it was. Much to my dismay though, when I got to the crash site, there was nothing there. I mean, there was a hole in the ground, but nothing else. It was just a massive empty crater in the middle of the woods. I thought I was going crazy. I thought first that I had imagined the entire thing. And then I tried to rationalize that I had found the wrong spot, that this wasn't really where it had landed. But I soon understood that neither of those things were the case. Nope. In actuality, the damn thing just disappeared. But I'll tell you this, it didn't disappear without a trace. I jumped down into the big hole at the crash site to have a look around, and to check that the ship wasn't, like, invisible or something. And believe it or not, I found some debris. Debris is vague, I know. But this was the really strange part. I collected all the weird rocks that were scattered at the base of the crater and shoved them in my pockets. I looked around but found nothing else strange, and so I skedaddled out of there ASAP and took off in my car. Right away, I called my friend Tom, who is a rockhound and amateur geologist. He analyzed them and tested their densities and checked for Mohs hardness, or whatever, and tells me that the rocks I found were scraps of meteorites. That's right. Rocks from the sky. Insane. You might not see how this is substantial, but the fact is that if what I saw was any other known aeronautical machine, there's no way in hell it would have been up in space like it was. There's no way it would have vanished, disappeared with almost no trace, unless, of course, it was something much rarer than any old airplane. My personal theory is that the thing teleported, that it entered our atmosphere and crashed somehow. And then by using some kind of weird technology, it got teleported back to wherever it came from before anyone else could see it. I've been scratching my head, kinda going crazy about it to be honest. Since then, I haven't seen anything strange. But that doesn't mean I haven't been on the lookout for it. I bought a huge telescope, and now I find myself frequenting some unsavory parts of the internet to try and make sense of everything I witnessed. Not a lot of people in my personal life believe me, so I'm hoping at least you will. I'm Italian and have been waiting to get in touch with you. I want to tell you about this wild experience I had in Ravello, Italy. Ravello is this cool village on the cliffs of Italy's Amalfi Coast. My name's Carlo, by the way, and I'm just a history professor from Rome, really into stories about my country. Every summer, I take a break to go somewhere and dig into some history. This time, Ravello was my choice because of its old buildings and great views. So, I was walking around the place one evening. That night, as usually happens, when the sun went down, the streets started getting lit by lanterns. The shadows got all long, and although beautiful, were also a bit creepy, and I could smell flowers blooming and hear the sea not too far away. Then, out of nowhere, everything suddenly went silent. It was like the whole town stopped breathing or something. Right then, I heard this weird noise, kind of like wings flapping in the wind. The silence got even more intense, except for that flapping sound. So, naturally, I got curious and decided to check it out. I followed the sound and ended up at this old rundown cathedral that was just at the top of the hill, maybe a 5-minute walk. At first, I looked around but saw nothing. I knew this church welcomed visitors at any time, and so I went inside, hating how the wooden doors made this creaking sound that echoed all over. Once inside, I walked around slowly as my eyes got used to the dim light of just the candles, and I saw something I can't even begin to explain. It was off in a corner, and its movement caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a priest or other church worker, but at first I couldn't quite tell. What confused me was that it was tall, about 6 feet, but looked like a mix between a man and an animal. It had black feathers all over it, and these huge leather wings, like a bat's, were on its back. I wondered at first if it was some type of ancient cloak, and that I was intruding on some unique ceremony. Let's just say that I wasn't a regular church goes, and so anything could have been the truth at that point. But anyway, the craziest part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. When this thing finally turned and looked toward me, I could tell that there were just 2 big red eyes glowing in the dark. Man, I was scared. My heart was beating like crazy, and I was sweating bullets. My legs felt like jelly, and I was just trying to make sense of what I was seeing. So, there I was, still inside the cathedral, my heart pounding so loudly it sounded like drums. I was sweaty, my legs were wobbly, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. And all the while, that thing just kept staring at me with its glowing red eyes, not moving or making a sound. You know that feeling when you lock eyes with someone and there's like a connection? It was like that, but way more intense. I felt like it knew me somehow, and it gave me the creeps. Time just seemed to stop as we stared at each other. Finally, I got up the nerve to take a step back, even though every part of me was yelling to run away. But the creature didn't move. It just kept looking at me, and then it opened its wings. Man, they were even bigger and scarier than I first thought. The rustling sound they made filled the whole place, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of amazement and terror. Then, out of nowhere, it made this sound. I can't even describe it. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but something older, more unsettling. It bounced off the walls and hit me right in the chest. And then, with one big flap, it flew up into the cathedral's roof, like up into the rafters, and was then gone. I couldn't see it at all anymore. It was like it knew of a secret exit up there. That was it for me. I turned and ran out of there as fast as I could, but somehow I could feel it watching me, and I even thought I heard the soft sound of its wings as it took off. I didn't stop running until I was back in the busy main section of Ravello, where I collapsed against a wall, trying to catch my breath. I was back in reality, but I couldn't shake what had just happened. The memory of that creature, its wings and those glowing eyes was stuck in my head. I spent the rest of the night just trying to process it all. Even now, As I'm writing this down, I still feel terrified. It's just so unbelievable, so eerie. In the ensuing days, I found myself drawn back to the cathedral, back to the place of the encounter. I was driven by a strange fascination, a need to understand what I had witnessed. The creature was never there, despite me stopping multiple times at different times of the day. Its existence marked only by the faint trace of an otherworldly presence. But maybe it was only me who felt that. The encounter changed me in ways I can still hardly comprehend. My pursuit of history, of forgotten tales and mysteries, had led me too close to something I had wanted to see. Basically, I crossed paths with a creature of legends. From then on, every creak of a door, every rustle of feathers, every hint of a shadow brought me back to that night. The creature had vanished, but its memory loomed large for me. April 2017. April 2017. I was spending the week with my mom and my new stepdad up in northern Michigan. It was 2017, and I was halfway through high school. Classes were still in session, but on account of my mom's new marriage, my brother and I were allowed to spend some extra family time together outside of school. My mom seemed to feel a vacation would somehow bring us all closer. So we rented a cabin. It was all right, I guess. It was a quaint little place with a bit of a kitschy country feel, not like the city where I was used to living. I thought my new stepdad was a little weird. He liked to tell stories about werewolves and other creepy cryptid creatures. He believed they were all somehow related. In my opinion, the creatures were one and the same, but that was only based on what I heard, not actual facts. My stepdad was convinced he'd actually seen one of the creatures when he was a boy. I guess that's what started his whole infatuation with the idea. I personally have never been one to blindly believe anything anyone told me. I needed proof. The Dogman, for example, was a highly unlikely being, a creature with a man's body and the head of a dog. I had a strong interest in biology, and the whole thing just didn't add up genetically. On that fateful day when everything changed, I had just entered the dining room. My brother was just about to take a bite out of his sandwich. He could see the look on my and my stepdad's faces, and his eyes shifted from our stepdad, and then to me. We both were staring over my brother's shoulder and out the window behind him. My stepdad and I exchanged astonished glances. We just couldn't believe what was happening. There, in the backyard, was a man hunkered over with his head in our charcoal grill. It was odd behavior to say the least. My stepdad had made us all steak and a salad for lunch, but the surface of the grill had been cooled to the touch for some time, so why anyone would want to sniff the bricks of coal was beyond me. I think my brother thought we were staring at him. He lowered his sandwich down toward his plate as if being silently judged. My stepdad and I, of course, weren't judging anyone. We continued to watch in horror as the man lifted his shaggy mane and sniffed around. It was then we realized this was no ordinary man. In fact, it wasn't a man at all. The shirtless human male torso appeared to be chestnut brown in color. Yet the head was what captivated us the most. Long strands of hair, wispy and thick like a Pomeranian, painted on in thick coats of jet black, coppery red, and a shock of white, stretched out on both sides of its face. Oh, but the eyes! The eyes were what kept us mesmerized. They were both a piercing amber color. I had never seen anything so strange and so beautiful in my entire life. The creature straightened his stance. He knew he'd been seen and that we were watching him. I tugged on my stepdad's shirt sleeve. We sprinted from the dining room through the kitchen toward the back door and towards the patio area. We both charged for the door. My stepdad beat me there, but I wasn't upset. All I could think about was getting a better look at the creature outside. Once my stepdad and I stumbled our way out into the open, the impossibly tall dog-like man began to back up while still staring at both of us. I reached out my hand, unsure if the creature would act like a dog or a man. To my utter amazement, the creature howled. At least, I think it was a howl. It kind of sounded like a human screaming. Its teeth were long and curved, like miniature spikes, only much thinner. They were still bigger in size than a large breed canine's teeth. None of them were jagged like in the urban legends I'd heard in the past. My blood began to curdle and I started to seriously wonder why we had come outside. Both of my palms started to sweat and my heart raced like crazy inside my chest. Fight or flight had kicked in and I wished desperately it would all go away. But I couldn't. I had forgotten how to move. My stepdad hadn't though. He had slipped his cell phone deftly out of his back pants pocket and was lifting it to capture a few seconds of live footage. Upon seeing the phone, the creature spun around quickly. Now I could see that its lower torso appeared to be that of a canine. It was strange to watch it run off on 2 feet, and I actually doubted that I was really seeing what I was seeing. In my opinion, I don't think canines were ever meant to run as bipeds. It gives them a strange kind of gait, or at least this one was strange. It almost bounced as I watched it bob up and down in a blur of speed. I stared after it for a long time, eventually staring at the spot where it ran off into the trees. My stepdad looked almost giddy with a huge grin on his face. I'd never seen him smile so big in all the time I'd known him. I was astonished that he wasn't afraid at all, and I was hoping he had gotten some footage. But when I peeked over to watch his video, the image was distorted. My stepdad frowned and scratched his head. His spirits had now clearly plummeted. I kind of felt bad for him. He'd waited so long to prove the existence of these wild creatures, and now it had shown up and he had no proof, other than the fact that my brother and I had both seen it. In some strange way, witnessing the dogman so close and in person had brought me and my stepdad a little closer than we once were. I guess we now had more in common since I believed, just like him. We headed back inside the house, not in defeat, but as a newly formed team in search of the truth. I know it exists. He knows it exists. And now you know it too. That is, as long as you believe what I'm saying. My suggestion is to never stop believing in these creatures. I know I won't. Some things can't be rationalized or explained. I understand that. I know when some things are more make-believe than factual. But I have to admit, I found myself in one heck of a dilemma that summer night. I'm not one for ghost stories. My grandparents sure liked telling them when I was growing up. But they weren't for me. I liked reality, even as a kid. So that's what makes this encounter so difficult for me to express, because I cannot explain with certainty what all had happened. Being part of law enforcement, we are taught to think with logic and factually accurate information. And even though our town was a bit into folklore and all of that, we knew what was real and what wasn't. That's how it was to me then. Black and white. Fact and fiction. I've mentioned I've heard stories about spooky things. So I was familiar with some of the crazy things people dreamed up. But I never gave them much weight. Anyhow, I was working one day. It was hot. It was the middle of summer. This particular day, we had been called to help a lady. She said that some delinquents were harassing her and her kids. She said they'd been doing some awful things like throwing rocks at her kids in their house. One had even taken out one of her windows. The woman was furious, as one might imagine. She said that her kids had been playing in the backyard and that they had seen someone in the trees. She said that they were throwing rocks at her kids. So her kids do what kids do. Monkey see, monkey do. You know the saying. And her kids start throwing rocks. They think it's some fun game that they got going on. But one of the kids gets a rock to the head. The woman thought her kid had a concussion. But they didn't. They were fine. But the problem was that they continued to do it. And someone else was teaching them to do it. This was many decades ago. So teaching your kids right from wrong was very straight and narrow. If I had that woman for a mother, I would have been scared to get the belt, you know what I mean? But the woman said she was wanting to get to the bottom of the behavior and hold the juveniles accountable for teaching her kids such awful behavior. I agreed with the woman. Something needed to be done. So we went to the woman's home. Sure enough, one of her windows was busted out, and one of the kids was still walking around with a bandage wrapped all the way around their head. It was a bit unusual. The situation. Sometimes I still think about it. Something just seemed off right off the bat. But what we discovered was much darker than some teenagers being knuckleheads. We interviewed the children and the mother. The mother just kept talking about how those kids needed to be punished, and where were their parents? Sometimes, when someone is so worked up like that, the best thing to do is nod your head, because nobody, is going to change their mind. That's how my mother was too, and my sister, all of us in our family really. When we have our minds made up, good luck. So then we start talking to the children. The oldest one stated that they were outside playing tag, and that someone had been throwing rocks. So they started throwing rocks back. They said it was to teach the other person a lesson at first, but that it eventually turned into a fun game. The middle child, the one with the bandage, had said that they'd been playing this game for a couple of weeks now. They hadn't seen the kid who was playing with them, but that they were starting to make good friends. The youngest, they had the most information. They said that the kid in the woods was more like a man, and that they could see their eyes in the trees, that they smelt awfully bad. But they then said, "Mama says we can't make fun of people for that." So we made friends. At this point, I'm starting to fear that the children are interacting with a town squatter. But I don't tell the mother anything. I didn't want to frighten her. I stayed several days at the house, but it wasn't until the fourth day that the rocks started to hit the house again. The woman was angry, and she started pacing around her house shouting all sorts of things. But I told her that she needed to keep it down so I could catch the perpetrator in the act. She did as much, but she didn't like it. I quietly made my way outside, and my way out towards the back. Sure enough, rocks were flying past my head, so I had to keep ducking. Eventually, I found myself behind a big pile of firewood, and I just stayed behind that. Those rocks weren't stopping, so I had to start yelling at the person, but it didn't make much difference. Finally, I peeked my head around the side of the firewood, and I could see whoever it was hiding being the trees. It was a dark figure, and it smelled terrible, just like the child had said, and it looked as if it were watching me. The rocks finally stopped. I'm not sure if it was because they didn't have any more to throw, or if it was because it saw me looking at them. So I edged closer to the perpetrator, but it ran away fast. Before it did, I got a bit more of a look at it, and truth be told, that thing was covered in dark hair. Now, I told you I don't do ghost stories or anything like that, but I can't quite explain what was throwing those rocks. You hear these stories growing up, and you think, that's not true, no way. But I'm realizing the world isn't as black and white as I thought. Maybe there is some gray area in between. I can't believe I'm writing this, but I've got to get this down just so I don't think I'm crazy. My sister and I have always been close. When we moved out after college, we stayed in roughly the same area, so we made a point of visiting often. Until 2019 anyway, because she moved several hours north for a new job. I promised I would drive up to see her and her new place as soon as I could. But the pandemic hit, and I had to delay my trip for about a year and a half. When I was finally able to go, I was so excited. I was looking forward to seeing my sister and getting some peace and quiet. 2 days before I was supposed to go, Janet called me and she seemed, a little off. She teased me about little things like remembering to pack my toothbrush and extra socks, but she sounded kind of nervous. Then she told me that it was very important that I get an early start, so I would get there before dark. I brushed it off because she's always made fun of me for being a late riser. But then she repeated it and said it was serious because the road to her house always gets dark super fast. She even made me promise that I would leave early to get there before sundown. I didn't see why it was such a big deal because I drive home from work at night all the time. But I figured she was just being a typical overprotective big sister. So I promised. We said goodbye and hung up. Fast forward to the day of the trip. I set my alarm early, but it didn't go off. So I overslept and had to start way later than I wanted. I felt bad because I'd promised, but it wasn't really my fault anyway, so oh well, right? At first, nothing out of the ordinary happened. But once I left the city and started on that long stretch of highway that cuts through the middle of nowhere, some weird stuff started happening. I'd look at the time and then I'd blink, and it would be like 30 minutes later, or my radio would cut out suddenly, or switch channels on its own. The longer I drove, the more frequent the weird stuff became. It started off slow but ramped up to something happening every couple of minutes. And then the sun set. Okay, I thought Janet was over-exaggerating when she told me about this. And you probably think I'm over-exaggerating now, but I swear it was practically instantaneous. 1 minute it was sunshine, and the next I could barely see in front of me even with the headlights on. It was like the night just slammed down on my car. I must have gotten confused at some point because I somehow found myself driving down a narrow side road away from the main highway that I was supposed to take. It cut right through the surrounding woods, and the trees were practically touching the sides of my car. I thought about trying to turn around, but I quickly realized it wasn't possible. I checked my GPS app and saw that if I just kept going for a couple more miles, there would be a spot where I could merge back onto the main road. As I drove, I started getting this really creepy feeling like I was being watched. I told myself that I was just tired and spooked from the long drive. I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere at night. Nobody was out here but me, right? I managed to calm myself down, but barely a minute passed before I heard the most terrifying sound ever. It was a high-pitched shriek, and I thought it was an animal, but somehow it sounded eerily human. It startled me so bad that I automatically pressed the gas a little harder. Everything happened so fast. First, I felt the car dip. Then there was a loud bang. Then I jerked the steering wheel hard to the right to get away from the noise. But the car just sort of dragged. I took my foot off the gas. My heart was beating so fast I thought I'd die. It took me a second to calm down enough to realize that I'd probably just blown a tire. According to GPS, I was really close to the highway. I called Janet to let her know what had happened. She said she'd pick me up, but she sounded very worried. She said to walk the rest of the road to the highway and don't hang up. I was nervous about traveling alone and on foot, but it was a short walk and I was still on the phone with Janet, so I felt a little better. I had almost reached the edge of the trees when this awful stench hit my nose. It was definitely something rotten and decaying. I don't know what death smells like, but I'm sure this must be it. Then it happened. A blood-curdling shriek, just like before, but closer this time. Much, much closer. And it sounded like it was directly behind me. I turned around and I swear that for a second I saw a pair of glowing red dots like eyes, but they disappeared behind the trees. I freaked out and started sprinting for the highway. I don't know why, but somehow I was certain that something was pursuing me, and that it was just letting me go because it wanted to. There were no more screams, but that horrible smell stayed. After that, it was a blur. I just remember vague flashes. Reaching the highway, getting in Janet's car, walking in her front door. I don't think either of us said more than a couple words. The next morning, everything was weirdly normal. Janet was oddly chipper and gushed about being so glad to see me. My car was even parked in her driveway with all 4 tires intact. I tried to talk to her about what happened last night, but she just kept saying vague stuff about how it must have been a tiring drive, and how she always had weird dreams after a long trip. Maybe it was just a weird dream. Janet and I had a great time catching up and swimming in the nearby lake. Everything was perfect until it was time for me to go home. I hadn't gone into my car since I got to Janet's place, and when I opened my car door, I got hit full in the face by a horrible stench, rot and decay. It was the same horrible smell as that night in the woods. If the smell is real, then what else about that night is real? I don't know if I want to find out.